Good evening to you all. Our guest speaker, Professor Dame Averil Cameron, needs no introduction, especially among scholars of patristic studies. However, I would like to mention very briefly a few things relating to her activities. Professor Dame Averil Cameron was warden of Keble College, Oxford, from 1994 to 2010, and was before that at King's College, London, where she was also the first director of the Center for Hellenic Studies. She has been president of the Ecclesiastical History Society and chair of the Oxford Patristic Conference, which its historical role has been mentioned in several lectures yesterday, and of which she remains a director. I will not go over her long list of publications. You are all familiar with them. However, among those that have recently shaped my mind and activity is The Perception of Crisis, published in 1998, and inspired our conference that took place last summer on religious experience of crisis in the 4th to 7th centuries in the Institute for Advanced Studies. We have her to thank for the many publications that shape our field. She is also responsible for raising several leading questions that turn out to be the axis of much scholarly activity, such as how to read heresiology, how to perceive a crisis, what is the precise meaning of Constantine's revolution, what was Byzantium, how and when did Byzantium begin? She taught us in her book, Christianity and the Rhetoric of Empire, about the power of Christian discourse, religious symbols, and the power of the imaginaire in late antique Christianity. Her elegant writing and intellectual finesse continue to have an enormous impact on Byzantine studies. She has not only made the Byzantine studies interesting, as Peter Brown once wrote, but she steadily continues to widen the horizon of the field, as apparent in her two recent edited books, Doctrine and Debate in the East Christian World from 3000 to 1500, edited by Robert Hoyland, together with Professor Cameron in 2011, and the second edited volume, Late Antiquity on the Eve of Islam, as well as we can all witness in her lecture tonight on patristic studies and the emergence of Islam. Professor Cameron, please.
Thank you very much, Brouria. And thank you to the other people principally responsible for the invitation, to Theo van Bruin, Carol Harrison, and yourself, and Daniel also for his wonderful organizing, especially as I came in at a rather late stage. And the Oxford Patristic Conference has been mentioned, as you said, and I would like to say two things about that. First of all, that we are three things. We are preparing for the next one in 2015. I forget how many, but 5 or 6 volumes at least of Studia Patristica are about to appear within the next month or two. That last time we had more than 900 delegates. Now, we do, I suppose, aim at inclusiveness. It's difficult, but my fellow directors are very insistent that we must do that. We can't go more than 1,000 because the examination schools won't hold it. So, but it certainly is very strong. And then finally, I'd just like to bring you, I'm sure, greetings from Gillian Clark, Professor Gillian Clark, who is the chair of the directors of the forthcoming one. So, to my subject. What has Islam to do with patristic studies? What can patristic studies contribute to our understanding of the emergence of Islam. Here in Jerusalem, after 2 days of papers concerned with our discipline, these seem to be worth asking, questions worth asking. But for the most part, scholars of early Islam and of the Quran, and patristic scholars, seem to operate in different worlds. Not only are disciplinary boundaries maintained, but also methodologies, questions, and approaches. I was first struck by this in the 1980s, not in relation to patristic studies, but to late antique history, when I joined with 2 colleagues in Arabic and in Islamic archaeology to set up a series of workshops and a publication series that became Studies in Late Antiquity and Islam. Our aim was very simple. It was just to come together and talk to each other. Many volumes have been published, but sadly, the volume that should have collected the workshop papers on culture and religion never appeared. Furthermore, theology of a patristic sort did not feature much in our enterprise. And finally, its more or less companion series, The Formation of Classical Islam, published by Ashgate, has nothing patristic in it. So my question then, again, is what do patristics and early Islam have to do with each other? What can they have to do with each other? In the annual bulletin of the IAPS, I noticed there is no section on Christianity or patristics and Islam, unlike Christianity and Judaism. Yet the question of connection seems all the more important when one can detect, for instance, a distinct current trend to see the emergence of Islam, I'm talking about the very earliest stage, as a phenomenon of late antiquity, and Islam not as a sudden eruption from the deserts of Arabia, but as a product, in whatever way, of the religious framework of the Eastern Mediterranean. We can see this trend both among historians of late antiquity and among scholars of the Quran and early Islam. Take a recent publication, the Oxford Handbook of Late Antiquity, published in 2012. It contains a chapter by my colleague Robert Hoyland, or my former colleague Robert Hoyland, he's disappeared to New York now, with the title, Early Islam as a Late Antique Religion. And in it, he lists one by one the features of early Islam that, in his opinion, are characteristic of late antiquity. I'll come back to that. And we hear a good deal currently about Islam as a product of the so-called Judeo-Christian world. One doesn't have to look as far as the well-known skeptical studies of early Islam by scholars like John Wansborough, Gerald Horting, or Patricia Kroner and Michael Cook, with their book Hagarism, which came out as early as 1977, when current works on the Quran, for instance by Angelica Neuwirth or Gabrielle Reynolds, all seem to be looking for a late antique context. A Princeton University Press book of 2013, this year, by Garth Fowden, hasn't appeared yet, but it will do, places the emergence of Islam within an expanded late antiquity, but in his view continues up to the first millennium. A further book by a different scholar, currently in press with Cambridge, is entitled, uncompromisingly, The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity. Its author, this is Aziz Al-Azmeh of the Central European University in Budapest, and an Islamicist, an Arabist. He's already argued elsewhere for what he calls a Paleo-Muslim phase deeply embedded in the religious milieu of late antiquity. So, against this background, the question of what, if anything, patristic studies can contribute seems a very pressing one. This paper is going to be divided, roughly speaking, into about 3 parts, with a historical bit at the beginning and a conclusion. So I'll try and keep signposting. So first of all, about the disciplinary boundaries. There may be several reasons why this question has not really been raised very much before. And I think the first relates to the prevailing discipline of late antique studies or late antique history, in which, and history as opposed to patristics, in which, of course, Christian materials are basic and indeed Jewish, but which rarely engages in theological or what we might call Eastern patristic issues as such, leaving these aside for theology, the discipline of theology, or after a certain date to those scholars who are essentially historians or theologians of orthodoxy, of the Orthodox Church. Another reason, I think, is the well-known slowness, or apparent slowness, with which Christians of the 7th and 8th centuries seem to have engaged with Islam as a new religion. Or if they do, the strange lack of detail in what they have to say. This is very well known, it's been discussed many times, and awareness of what may seem to us, or has seemed to us, to be a rather surprising thing, has probably had the effect of discouraging a closer engagement by patristic scholars with actual scholarship on early Islam, and certainly, of course, vice versa. Put it another way, the search for sources about early Islam, in inverted commas, sources that is, and the excellent recent work done on the non-Muslim sources for early Islam by scholars like Robert Hoyland has got in the way of the sorts of questions that patristic scholars might be interested in, and I will come later on in this talk to what those questions might be. And then finally, I think we also need to recognise that a substantial proportion of the scholarship on Christian and Muslim relations in the early period springs ultimately from an interfaith and interconfessional context. And understandable though it is, and useful and important, of course, as the results may be, this is not a historian's question. It determines the questions that are asked, and it may serve to get in the way of asking others. And these questions about ecumenism and confessional patristics have been coming up again and again in the last 2 days. But there is, I think, at the moment, a renewed interest among historians of late antiquity and others, many others, in finding the origins of Islam or explaining for themselves, you may think, the origins of Islam, for reasons I'm sure I don't need to explain. I need hardly say that such an enterprise is fraught with difficulties, not least because the Quran itself tells us very little about the historical background from which it sprang. Not about Muhammad, not about Mecca, and not about Medina. It's not surprising if, on the one hand, scholars have and still do, that is, Western scholars or non-Muslim scholars, have and still do accept the basic version presented in the later Arabic sources, the Hadith and the Siras, or if, on the other hand, they have turned, like Kroner and Cook, to what can be gleaned from the non-Muslim contemporary sources. Even if we accept an Arabian context for the Quran, which is far from being generally agreed among specialists, and I speak not as a specialist, obviously, and I speak as someone who's benefited very greatly from colleagues in Oxford, not least the influence of Guy Strumser and a seminar that he partly organised earlier this year. It's often stated that we know much more about Judea and Palestine in the 1st century AD than we do about Arabia in the early 7th. However, recent scholarship does have something to contribute, in fact, on the penetration of Arabia by Christianity. Furthermore, We also know from recent scholarship much more about Christianity in the Sasanian Empire. It was not simply an encounter with the Greek and Syriac-speaking Christians of the Byzantine Empire, previously written off in many standard accounts as dominated by monophysites who were supposed to have welcomed the Arabs because of alienation from the imperial religion of Constantinople. Nor is there any need nowadays to evoke the traditional figure of a Nestorian monk as the likely source of Christian material in the Quran. A recent study by Joel Walker has revealed the extent of formal religious debate between Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, and between Christians, sponsored by the Sasanian court in Ctesiphon in the 6th century. And he and others have written about the travels of East and West Christian holy men in the Sasanian Empire. They were traveling everywhere. The Spiritual Meadow by John Moschus from the early 630s indicates a dense world of monastic travel within the Roman Empire. Inside the Sasanian Empire, the school of Nisibis produced a line of Christian scholars, exegetes, and wandering scholars. It also had a scriptorium, as did the Christian monastery founded by Khosroes II, the powerful ruler of Persia, Iran, in the late 6th century, at Hulwan in western Iran. And the East Syrian monastery at Karg had a library with wall niches to hold its books. Probably the most striking development has been in recent scholarship, mainly French, on the kingdom of Himyar in South Arabia. That is modern Yemen, southwest Arabia, which is richly documented in inscriptions and written texts. In the early 6th century, this kingdom had a Jewish ruler who instigated a pogrom of Christians who actually had been established in the kingdom for a long time. This provoked a joint expedition from Byzantium and the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, Aksum, across the Red Sea. And that established a 50-year period of Christian rule in the mid-6th century, which only came to an end when the Sasanians took over about 570, the traditional year of the birth of the prophet. There's a wealth of recent scholarship on all of this, mainly in French, led by Christian Robin, and Glenn Bowersock has recently presented it briefly in 2 short books in English, one of them the Menahem Stern lectures given in Jerusalem. The point is that a Christian kingdom existed in southern Arabia during the 6th century, and indeed the sources suggest that the king in this period tried to extend his influence into Central Arabia, or even, on some admittedly doubtful accounts, to Mecca. Archaeological evidence also exists of monasteries and Christian settlement in the Gulf and the islands. It's not necessary to look for evidence now for a Christian community in Mecca, non-existent, to find possible connections. I think my point is that even if Arabia is where Islam took shape, and certainly the Sasanian Empire, both of these were penetrated by forms of Christianity in the 6th and 7th centuries, different forms in complex ways. We sometimes tend to think that the Byzantine and Sasanian spheres were insulated from each other. But of course, Khosroes II, Shah of Persia in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, as I said, was highly sympathetic to Christianity himself. He had a Christian wife and was a generous patron of the shrine of St. Sergius at Rashafa in Syria. So the point of this historical diversion is to emphasize that we as scholars often operate within divisions and categories that are much too sharp, a situation which is reinforced or even dictated by disciplinary boundaries and the boundaries of faculties, for example. I've also noticed that some of the most central contributions from within the field of Islamic or Quranic studies, which are arguing for a late antique context, do so without actually engaging with the deluge of late antique scholarship in recent years. And of course, it also goes without saying that not many late antique scholars actually engage with Quranic or early Islamic scholarship either. In recent work that I've done, and I hope I've finished it now and move on to something else, I've adopted a different model and referred to the late 6th and 7th centuries in the Near East as a region in ferment, or as the turbulent 7th century. And those descriptions don't merely concern political and military events, but also religious currents. Nor do they simply refer to the well-known and striking and powerful religious reactions to the Persian conquest of the Near East, and especially the Persian control of Jerusalem in AD 614, or to the Arab conquests and the arrival of Islam. I use them rather to refer to the widespread and complex religious developments, debates, and divisions that were already taking place and continued to take place alongside such momentous public events. Even while the Byzantines and the Arabs started to confront each other in the Near East, in Anatolia and in Egypt and North Africa in the 7th century, doctrinal divisions continued to occupy the attention of emperors and churchmen alike in Constantinople, Carthage, Rome, and the East. In the 630s, the very decade of the first Arab incursions into Syria, the Emperor Heraclius held discussions with Monophysites at Hierapolis, with Armenians at Theodosiopolis, and with Monophysites again in Egypt, all with the aim of bringing these groups together, in the huge effort of bringing these groups together, and with some success. The doctrines of one operation and one will in Christ dominated the middle years of the 7th century, but further discussions also continued with the Armenians at Devin in 653, under the Emperor Constans II. It is at least as legitimate to bring some of these contemporary theological concerns into play when trying to understand the contours of early Islam, as it is to adopt the strategies currently favoured among Islamicists of appealing, and I quote, and I'm coming to this, to a generalised monotheism, or again, to a generalised apocalyptic tendency, or positing the existence of otherwise unattested groups of heterodox or Jewish Christians and others who might have been possible conduits. I'm coming to the end of part 1. I'm not on part 2 yet. Any attempt to locate the emergence of Islam in a late antique context has to contend with the formidable difficulties inherent in the Quran itself. Curiously silent about the actual location of Muhammad's message, and extremely hard to date as a religious document, yet suffused with Christian and Jewish elements. I suggest first that even if the traditional account of its origin in Arabia is accepted, there were multiple ways in which these elements could have been absorbed and reused. Further, the polytheist pagan environment in Arabia, depicted in the later Arabic sources, which has been accepted on its own terms by many scholars in the past, the Jahiliyyah, does not cohere with what we actually now know. On the traditional view, again, that the Quran was written down and edited in the middle of the 7th century in Syria. This would have taken place in a context even more suffused with existing religious rivalries and discussions. Other views, for instance, accepted in a recent book by the patristic scholar Stephen Shoemaker, place the editing later, under Abd al-Malik at the end of the 7th century. But still, amid the heady mix of Christian and Jewish elements in 7th century Syria. More radical critics locate the evolution of the message itself completely outside Arabia, and indeed as emerging not out of an Arabian, but out of a Christian-Jewish context. Part 2. With this background, let us look at the arguments for a late antique context that are being offered by specialists on the Quran and on early Islam. Prominent among them are appeals first to existing monotheistic ideas, then to the prevalence of eschatology or apocalyptic in the contemporary Near East, then to the presence of Jewish Christians whose beliefs might account for the way in which Jesus is presented in the Quran, as a prophet, not as divine, and with a docetic denial that he really died on the cross. A recent book by the prominent scholar of early Islam, Fred Donner, Muhammad and the Believers, at the Origins of Islam, published in 2010, posits the widespread existence and membership in the earliest Islamic community of non-Trinitarian Christians, who were, he thinks, among the first believers, and he supposes who brought some of these ideas with them. The problem I have with this is one that also applies to some other recent writing, and I've mentioned it already, namely that Donner writes exclusively from within his own discipline. He doesn't even try to pin down this assumption within the actual historical context of late antiquity, the historical context well known to everyone who's here at this patristic conference. And the continued existence of heterodox groups, non-Trinitarian Christians or Jewish Christians at this date, is at least unattested and dubious. They feature, the latter feature in early heresiology, for example, Epiphanius, but to my knowledge are not mentioned in any reliable historical source in late antiquity. We heard Emmanuel Fiano talking about the historiography of Jewish Christians earlier today, and Guy Strumser has recently shown in a lecture and a lecture also in Paris that we owe the evolution of this very category of Jewish Christianity, in particular, to New Testament scholars and theologians of early Christianity, not to historians of late antiquity. Something similar, I suggest, also applies to positing other heterodox groups as possible sources. Of course, anything might be the case, but we don't know. I can only agree with Robert Hoyland when he writes, quote, that scholars tend to assume where the Quran offers a version of a story or a doctrine that does not conform to the official version, that it reflects the views of some heretical sect that has survived in Arabia. More likely, it's just that it gives us a hint of the broad array of narratives and beliefs that existed below the level of canonized and codified texts. That leaves us with monotheism and apocalyptic, or perhaps better, eschatology. So, monotheism first. It appears in the current literature, I mean. Of course, this is, as also we heard today, a long-standing issue. But I'm talking about current scholarship. So it appears in the shape of the idea of a kind of, quote, rising tide of monotheism in the late antique Near East, supposedly providing a congenial context for the Quranic insistence on one God alone. And you find this idea not only expressed by Quranic scholars and Islamicists, and Patricia Kroner has now argued that the pre-Islamic pagans were monotheist, you may be surprised, but also by late antique historians. And I'm just interested to see that there is a laboratoire of the CNRS in Paris to study ancient monotheisms. I hate to use the word fashionable, but it's certainly fashionable. It has been given more credence by the emphasis now laid on the seemingly monotheistic inscriptions of Himyar, the ancient Yemen, that kingdom that we know so much more about from its inscriptions, and indeed they do seem to be more or less monotheistic. According to the sadly deceased American historian of late antiquity and early Islam, Thomas Sisgerich, there was, and I quote, a semiotic koine of monotheistic religiosity within which Islamic narratives took shape. However, the concept that some scholars have put forward of pagan monotheism applied to Greco-Roman religion, particularly in a book of essays edited by Michael Frader and Polimnia Athanasiadis a few years ago, that has come under some criticism lately. And as for its applicability to Christianity in late antiquity, or in the patristic period, suffice it perhaps to say that this is also the very period when within Christianity the cult of saints and the veneration of relics, and indeed images, were proliferating. And just to remind ourselves that the strongest message in the Quran in relation to Christianity is to assert that God cannot be divided, God cannot have a son. And that suggests to me, rather, not that the Quran was tapping into an existing trend, but rather that there was not enough monotheism. Finally, in this section, eschatology apocalyptic. I return to Stephen Shoemaker because I've been reading him lately. He's a patristic scholar who has also been writing about early Islam, and he has recently provided a vigorous reassertion of the argument that the primary message of Muhammad was to proclaim the imminence of the hour, the end of things, when all would be judged, not to be a social reformer, but a social and moral reformer, but an eschatological messenger. Well, I cannot go into the arguments, which are for specialists, about these two views. But this emphasis on eschatology and the imminence of the end, the hour, coincides with statements quite common in current secondary literature, some of which I've referred to the effect that, quote, there was a general trend towards apocalyptic in the late antique Near East. And that makes Islam seem more late antique as well. For Robert Hoyland, in his article in the Oxford Handbook of Late Antiquity, this was a spirit, quote, which, quote, early Islam seems to have caught. For Fred Donner, in the book I mentioned, apocalyptic ideas, quote, were a particular feature of the religious climate of late antiquity, with an obvious appeal, he thinks, given what he calls the harsh reality of life in the Byzantine domains. I don't quite recognise that. Finally, in John C. Reeves' useful guide to Jewish apocalypses, we read that the apocalyptic imagination, in the words of John C. Collins, operated, and I quote, more or less continuously within the broader ethnic or religious framework of the wider Near East. And that in the 7th and later centuries it was, quote, figured as a mentality. It was, quote, a type of narrative within, quote, a formulaic set of conventions, tropes, and figures. Well, I think there are problems here as well. Certainly, eschatological and apocalyptic ideas were common. Whether they were such a dominant feature of late antiquity, I rather doubt myself. Further, the well-known Jewish apocalypses from the context of the Persian occupation of Jerusalem, and the later and perhaps even better known Syriac apocalypses, like the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, with their quasi-historical scenarios based on the four kingdoms of the book of Daniel, are very different from the proclamations of the hour, the imminent hour, in the Quran. Appeals to something that was allegedly in the air in late antiquity don't really seem to me to help very much. In the third section of this paper, I'd like to turn to some examples, finally, from patristic studies that I think are worth bringing into the discussion and seem to be generally lacking. At least they're lacking in studies by Islamicists. We who are here know very well that the 7th century was an extraordinarily tense time for doctrinal and political developments within Christianity. These are obscured, though, if the Arab conquest of Jerusalem, late 630s, is taken as a chronological boundary, a periodization marker. And they're also, as it happens currently, the subject of very active historical as well as patristic scholarship. So I think I'm saying don't make the Arab conquests a way of expressing periodization. And many books, especially older books, end or begin, as the case may be, about AD 640, 638. It doesn't help at all. Leading some of these developments was, of course, Maximus the Confessor. Incidentally, one of our earliest non-Muslim authors to indicate awareness of the appearance of a new prophet. Maximus had already left for North Africa in the 640s. Also the decade of Leontius of Neapolis' lives of Simeon the Fool and John the Almsgiver, the latter appended to an earlier life by Moschus and Sophronius. Maximus went from North Africa to Rome, from where he was arrested by the imperial authorities, taken to Constantinople, went into exile and died. It's perhaps understandable then that most of the huge scholarly literature on Maximus detaches him from what I believe to be his Palestinian background, accepting the value of the hostile monothelite vita, and deals with his writings only in theological terms. It's occasionally forgotten that Maximus was also a close associate. It's not forgotten in Oxford for reasons I will come to. It's occasionally forgotten that Maximus was also a close associate of Sophronius, the future patriarch of Jerusalem, who, according to the legends, handed over Jerusalem to Umar. And Sophronius, whose works extended much more widely than technical theology, or what I call technical theology. Sophronius was also close to John Moschus, author of The Spiritual Meadow, as explored in a memorable article by Henry Chadwick in the Journal of Theological Studies in 1974. These connections will be brought out later this year in a forthcoming book on John Moschus, Maximus and Sophronius by Philip Booth, who is based in Oxford. We don't read much in scholarship on early Islam of the monasteries of Palestine in this period, from which Maximus and Sophronius came, and John Moschus, which were crucially important centres of religious activity or activism in the 7th century. But I think we should. Excuse me. When it comes to John of Damascus, later in the Umayyad period, something similar strikes me. Most of the scholarly work on John approaches him simply as a Byzantine or patristic theologian, a very important one, perhaps the last patristic theologian, according to some. He features straightforwardly as a Byzantine writer in the history of Byzantine literature by the late Alexander Kazhdan, who memorably wrote, "Can we imagine Byzantine literature without John of Damascus?" Andrew Louth, in his important book on John, offers a strongly monastic and, to me, convincing context for the way that John wrote. At the same time, the question of whether John was in any sense an original theologian or an original philosopher has gained new attention in the context of a new interest in investigating Byzantine philosophy as such, and especially in asking the question whether Byzantine philosophy is distinguishable from theology. The traditional view of John among philosophers has been that he has little to offer of any interest. A recent article argues strongly that his major work, the Pigignosis, or the Fount of Knowledge, is entirely derivative. The author does not consider the intriguing question of what the library resources might have been at the Marsaba monastery at the time, but speculates that John might have had a copy of the mysterious philosopher Stephanus of Alexandria. Indeed, there is some uncertainty, according to Marie-France Auzepy, about whether John was in fact a monk at Marsaba monastery, and problems about the sources for his biography which parallel those for Maximus Confessor. The author of the paper I mentioned simply assumes, without question, the historicity of the later Arabic vitae, which are very dubious, in fact, without discussing the strange silence about John in the sources that we do have for Marsaba in the 8th century. John of Damascus's 3 orations in defense of religious images are of great importance. And again, they tend to feature in works on Byzantine iconoclasm, without much discussion of the fact that few, if any, in Constantinople were apparently aware of them or had read them, the works themselves, as opposed to knowing in general terms that he was arguing in favour of images. On the other hand, Sidney Griffith has argued, in complete contrast, that John's target was nearer home, that he must be understood in the local context of iconoclastic tendencies in the Umayyad context. The fact is, we have no direct information. But with their emphasis on the issue of idolatry, John of Damascus's orations on religious images can be placed well within the tradition of the Christian Versus Judaeus literature, which was such a key contemporary production, and which had already been begun to incorporate religious images, that is, icons, as an example of the created objects whose veneration Christians needed to defend. Finally, John's famous extra heresy, in quotes, of Islam, the last chapter in his book on heresies, is usually discussed with other non-Muslim sources for early Islam, as though it can tell us something about it, when in fact it entirely fits the structure and tradition of his catalogue of heresies, its heresiological standard. So these famous examples are indicative of the disciplinary divide I talked about earlier. Whatever theory we adopt about the genesis of the Quran and its writing down, or the date of its collation, Islam was still taking shape during the very decades that saw intense theological development, debates, and divisions among Christians. So in what remains of my time, I'm going to take further brief examples, first of all, the cult of the cross and that of the Virgin, which are surely not without interest in view of the presentation of Jesus and Mary and the crucifixion in the Quran. Again, Sidney Griffith is one of the scholars to whom we owe awareness of how central the cross was felt to be as a badge of Christian identity during the Umayyad period, and especially under Abd al-Malik, the builder, we suppose, of the Dome of the Rock. We're all well aware as well of the Emperor Heraclius' symbolic return to Jerusalem in AD 630 and his restoration of the fragments of the true cross to Golgotha, a momentous act which some scholars, including Herrick Reinink, interpret in an apocalyptic way. Somewhat less noted, but closer to our patristic theme, is the distinct increase in emphasis on the cross in this period in liturgy and theological writing. The liturgical feast of the exaltation of the cross on the 14th of September gained prominence. Homilies were written on the theme of the cross. The dead Christ began to appear for the first time in crucifixion scenes in Eastern Christian visual art. Sure indicators of a changing context, the Christian Adversus Judaeus texts developed a comprehensive defense of the veneration of the physical wood of the cross against the charge of idolatry. And in the 8th century, the cross was adopted by the iconoclasts in preference to the figural representation of the dead Christ, or indeed religious images generally. In the 7th century, Anastasius of Sinai had developed a striking defense himself of visual representations of the crucifixion and of Christ's real suffering on the cross. This is surely related to something we also heard about earlier today, the debates about whether and in what way the divine nature of Christ had suffered on the cross, which had divided Christians in the 6th century and which continued to do so in the 7th. To me, at least then, the Docetic, supposedly, denial of the crucifixion in the Quran is not perhaps so very surprising, and does not require us to posit groups, continuing groups of heterodox or Docetic Christians, or non-Trinitarian Christians, or indeed Jewish Christians. Instead, it spoke to those Christian concerns, ones that have been manifested in the disputes since the late 5th century onwards about the addition to the Trisagion, and among the Julianist groups in the 6th century and later. Babai the Great, for example, Catholicos of the Church of the East, who died about 628, was a strong opponent of the idea that God could suffer. Another feature of the late 6th and early 7th century in Christianity was a growing emphasis on the power of saints. And this can be seen in a proliferation of saints' lives in Greek, Syriac, and the other languages of Eastern Christianity. It caused some to question their intercession and the power of their relics, while appearances of saints in visions and miracles associated with their images, their pictures and icons, were accompanied by equal anxiety as to the proper visual representation of holy personages. Gilbert Dagrand has written about this brilliantly. In the 7th century, the famous Canon 82 of the Council in Trullo of the early 690s sought to regulate the depiction of Christ by requiring him to be depicted in the flesh and forbidding him to be represented symbolically as a lamb, thus asserting the reality of his human nature and suffering. Again, to me, this speaks to the Docetic and anti-Docetic debates, and the anxieties surrounding the proliferation of saints cults speak to the Quranic insistence on an uncompromising monotheism. As for the symbolic versus the real, we could point further. We could point, for example, to the theology of Maximus Confessor's Mystagogia, a work of the 630s, as being expressive of contemporary concerns about representation, in its emphasis on symbolic or mystical interpretation, here applied by Maximus to the liturgy. Finally, yet another developing feature in late patristic Christianity concerned the cult of the Virgin, well documented in many recent scholarly contributions. The same Stephen Shoemaker has also, as it happens, recently translated the earliest hagiographical life of the Virgin, which he thinks might possibly have been composed by Maximus the Confessor himself, but which in any case he thinks is datable to this very period, the 7th century. She features very frequently in contemporary anecdotes from the late 6th and in the early 7th century about miracles and apparitions. She was often depicted in visual art, in AIAPS mosaics with the child, in early images. We don't have very many of these left in the main areas of the Byzantine Empire for reasons of iconoclasm. As it happens, some of the earliest ones are still extant or in Rome. But there's plenty of evidence in written evidence. The exact role of Mary was, needless to say, crucial to any debate about the nature of the Incarnation, and in particular assertions of the divine nature of Christ. Surely our understanding of the Quranic portrayal of Mary can only be deepened by awareness of these contemporary developments within Christianity, which went in parallel with renewed and agonizing anxieties about the real suffering and death of Christ. To conclude, I would argue that while a great deal of effort and attention has been paid by scholars to the Christian and Jewish reactions to the Persian invasion of the early 7th century, and especially the capture of Jerusalem in 614, much less effort has been expended on the theological developments of the succeeding period and their possible links with the emerging Muslim system. I would like to argue simply for a more holistic view, which neither detaches the theology of such figures as Sophronius, Maximus, and John of Damascus from their Near Eastern background, nor sees the non-Muslim writers of the period primarily as sources for early Islam. In his recent book, sorry, I'm back to Stephen Shoemaker again. In his recent book, The Death of a Prophet, came out this year, the patristic scholar Stephen Shoemaker has made a forceful case for an early stage of Islam which focused on Jerusalem and the Temple. He's not the first to make this case. If it were widely accepted, it would force us to rethink not only Islamic origins, but also Christian and Jewish thinking in the 7th century, in the period after the conquests. I leave this argument aside because Shoemaker's book also raises questions about methodology, and they are what concern us even more deeply here, in that he makes a brave case for the application of the methods of New Testament and biblical criticism to Islamic origins. In so doing, his book provides a very detailed and helpful overview of Islamic scholarship on early Islam, past and present. I'm sorry he's not here to speak for himself, and I should say that I'm not convinced by all his central arguments. But as an overview of some of these debates and the state of the question, it's extremely useful. And his book challenges us as patristic scholars to cross the divide, to think outside the box, to review our disciplinary boundaries, and that can only be a good thing. In this paper, I have certainly not tried to suggest direct borrowings, still less sources, for elements in the Quran. Much too crude. Nor have I or could I venture into the complex issue of its date and environment, or tried to suggest that it took shape within a Palestinian or Syrian milieu. I'm not arguing for any of those positions, and I wouldn't be equipped to do so. I have not aligned myself with the skeptical Islamicists who have presented a case in the past and still, in some cases, continue to do so, as essentially deriving from a Jewish or Christian background. But it's perhaps worth reiterating the surprising silences in the text that we have, most of all about the life and actual context of the prophet and his message. I think I'm suggesting, rather, that if Islam is really a religion of late antiquity, and I haven't gone into the question of Abrahamic religions in any kind of comparative way. That's a different way of looking at things, I think. I'm just suggesting that if Islam is really a religion of late antiquity, as a number of scholars are currently proposing, there are other ways of looking at it than by general assertions about monotheism or apocalyptic. And I think, at the same time, patristic studies, a discipline that has been greatly enriched by being extended into the worlds of Sasanian Persia and neighbouring Eastern cultures, would benefit, I believe, if it were less cut off from that of the beginnings of Islam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cameron, for such an illuminating lecture and for continue to raise such major questions that directly affect our work. Thank you for coming to Jerusalem, and we already expect your next visit. Good evening, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.